Hello, and welcome to No Memorial Library's podcast, Research Bites,
where we introduce you to new topics and talk about the who's, the whys, the whats, the wheres, and the whens.
Hey Celeste.
Hey Martha.
So I'm really excited today because we have with us Dr. Alex Mikaberidze, who's going to be talking about lost figures in the Napoleonic Wars.
Yeah, so Alex, thanks so much for being here. The Napoleonic Wars are kind of your specialty. You've published quite a few books, several of which have won awards. Do you want to kind of give us a brief overview of what you'll be talking about today?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited. Napoleonic Wars is my bread and butter, as you said. I've been researching it for almost 30 years now, and it is, to me, the most exciting of all historical periods. Because in many ways, the world that we know today was forged, crafted, created, however you want to put it, during this very turbulent revolutionary period. And of course, it starts with the great upheaval in France in 1789, which unleashes this revolutionary force. And for the next 26 years, the world is trying to come kind of to understanding how to deal with it. So the ideas of freedom, equality, the ideas of what the government is for and who is it by, the ideas that the French revolutionaries grappled with. And then ultimately, they go on and try to impose their vision of freedom, equality on many parts of Europe and beyond. So my research was and has been to underscore the global ramifications of the war, how this war impacted not just France, not just, let's say, Western Europe, but the world.
Sounds great. So now we're going to go do kind of a deep dive into your topic. Take it away whenever you're ready.
All right. Well, there is a different way you can kind of approach history, and especially history like Napoleonic era. And there are hundreds and hundreds of, actually hundreds of thousands of books written. Napoleonic era is the most detailed researched period in history. But my interest was, and it is both global and micro. So there is a famous French historian who kind of said that historians can be either like paragliders, jumping from the airplane and kind of coming down to earth and looking broadly, or they can be like truffle hunters, going for a walk in the forest and searching for little nuggets. And so I kind of dabble between them. So my book that you mentioned, Napoleonic Wars No, Global History, is the paraglider. But in my spare time, I like to search for truffles. And to do that, you go to archives. And so essentially, you sit in a building that is full of documents spanning hundreds and hundreds of years, and you try to find something that is relevant to your study, but also something that has never been seen before. And so a few years back, I was in France, working in the military archive, and I came across, by accident, this portfolio, a dossier. And it starts very interesting, and it has this kind of vivid starting point where a French bureaucrat, a military official, sits in his office in February of 1818, and he's reviewing the very dossier that I'm actually looking at. And his task is to decide whether to give a man a pension. And so initially it would have been, for me, it was one of many dossiers, and same for him. He would have reviewed probably hundreds of dossiers like this. But when I looked closely who was the man, I realized that through tracing this one man's life, his career, you can really deal with the great topics of history, such as slavery, inequality, the quest for understanding your life, or the sense of identity. Because this young man, whose pension this gentleman was deciding, was born in a very remote corner of the world. In fact, one of the things that stunned me when I was looking at it, this guy was from my hometown. And of course, I'm from country of Georgia, so I don't know how many Georgians you've met in your life.
Oh, yeah, none.
You're the only one.
Cool.
Yeah, not the fake ones from Atlanta. I'm talking about
The real ones.
Yeah. With that special accent in their voice. But this guy was not just from Georgia; he was from my hometown, and so I was blown away by this. And then, as I looked at his life, so here's a young man who is kidnapped as a child. So about between age maybe 8, 10, he's kidnapped, sold into slavery. So that would have taken him from Caucasus, which is now sandwiched between Turkey and Russia. So he would have been taken across the Black Sea to the great slave markets in the Ottoman Empire. And there, slavery was very entrenched in the Ottoman society, and you could have been a slave working in fields, or you could have been a sexual slave or a domestic slave. But this man had, I don't know if it's a fortune or luck or whatever you call it, but he was chosen to be a military slave. So meaning that he didn't have to toil in the fields or work at home, but he was trained for nothing but to fight in war. And so he became Mamluk. So Mamluk is a term describing this military slavery. And so he spent much of his life being a Mamluk. And as a Mamluk, he actually became part of the elite ruling Egypt until, that is, the French Revolution reached out across the Mediterranean Sea into Egypt. And so in 1798, we have a French invasion.
You say, so like these Mamluk warriors, like you mentioned, they have a lot of like privileges and stuff, but they were still slaves, right?
That's the weird institution of Mamlukdom, that on one hand, you start as a slave. You're owned by another individual who used to be a slave like you, but through their service, they achieve freedom. But then once they achieve freedom, they are determined to maintain their system because it has benefited them. So what they do is they sustain themselves by buying new slaves that are then serving them, and at a certain point they free them, and then the new generation kind of custom. And it's a natural, I think, progression is that we all gravitate towards people that are like us, I guess. So the reality in the 18th century in Egypt was that a group of Georgian Mamluks came to the top position, and what they would do is they would buy people who were Georgians, which is devastating to their communities back home, right? Yeah. Because they're essentially ripping these children out and bringing them, thousands of them every year, but it's self-serving to them because it means that they have their fellow countrymen that prop their power in Egypt. But you're right. They are slaves, but they are in an elite position where they're dominating the Egyptian society. They're collecting taxes. Common Egyptian people feed them, pay them money, like a protection racket, right?
Yeah. Was there a lot of did the soldiers who are not slaves resent them because of their?
There are no soldiers. So in Egypt, until French come, essentially the only soldiers allowed to be soldiers of Mamluks. Uh-huh. So they have the monopoly on violence.
Oh, okay.
I did not know that.
So they control. They have the access to weapons. They are the military enforcement. They are the state. Mm-hmm. Now they pay lip service to the Ottoman Sultan, who is in Istanbul, but otherwise they're governing themselves. They collect the money and they decide how that money is spent. And of course, they're enriching themselves. So they are quite wealthy, which allows them to, again, buy more slaves and then sustain the system. There is an interesting aspect to it, the agency of women, because the Mamluks, once they reach certain level, are allowed to have wives, although their children are not enslaved because they're born as Muslims, and Muslims cannot be enslaved. But the wives are allowed to inherit the share of the property of their husbands, and they are essentially considered to be full agents of the state, so they can engage in transactions, conduct business, sell and buy property.
Are they considered head of the household?
Yes or no. This is where it's unusual in that they are not considered head of household as long as the husband is alive, right? So it still is a dominantly male-centered society, but the women, especially the elite Mamluk women, have a much greater freedom of action than, I would say, an ordinary Egyptian or even ordinary European woman would have had.
Yeah,
I did not know that.
Yeah, that's so fast. They sound so interesting. I feel like we got you a little off topic a little bit.
No, well, that's what makes this subject so interesting, because there are so many different aspects and ways to approach it. And if we just look at this one life, then we have these kind of gateways in different parts of the history. And then when the revolution comes to Egypt, that even creates an even more complex reality, because these French revolutionaries come with these ideas of equality and freedom. But what do you do with a society where as unusual as it may sound, where people are not necessarily want to be free if that freedom comes through occupation. Yeah. So then you have to make people be free. You have to essentially force people to be free. And when the French occupy Egypt in 1798, they imposed this occupational regime designed to change how Egyptians live their lives. So that includes dismantling the Mamluk system, emancipating slaves. But it's such a profound change that a lot of locals respond with resistance to it. But not this guy. This guy actually sees the benefit in the system, and so he switches sides right away. And he joins the French army, and then for the next 3 years, he actually serves an occupying force as a collaborator, right? Well, ultimately, we know that Napoleon is defeated. The French are forced to leave Egypt. So this young man, whose original name we don't know, we only know his nickname, Chahin, which means in Arabic falcon. So this falcon boy now has to decide what to do. Is he staying in Egypt, or is he? And if he stays, he will pay the price for being collaborator, or should he follow Napoleon back to France and start anew? And if you're counting, this is all right. So he lost his original life, original name, original faith, identity when he was kidnapped in Georgia. Then he has crafted this new Mamluk identity, which he now has to also forsake to start anew somewhere else. And so he makes a decision to follow, and he follows the French to Europe. And then he spends the rest of his life serving this revolutionary cause.
Yeah, this is so interesting because it's like he basically gives up his identity twice.
Mm-hmm.
And I know he's so interesting too because like I know you mentioned in your paper that we don't have any of his journals or letters or anything from him. So we don't really know his thoughts, but any of the other Mamluks that changed sides, do they ever mention how they felt about basically giving up their identity twice?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. And in fact, that's what makes, I think, this project interesting to me, is there's a lot of things that have been written from the great, quote unquote, man's point of view. And again, you can include maybe individuals, but of course, most of them kind of men, right?
Yeah.
So you have hundreds of thousands of volumes on Napoleon, on Wellington, on Washington, right? But what makes projects like this for me interesting is that you're looking at the history from below rather than from the top. This is an ordinary man who's done some interesting things, but certainly nothing compared to, let's say, the great changes that some of these political military leaders brought. But they offer you a kind of different perspective in history. And it's a challenge because you have to craft history. And projects like this underscore how history is made. Right? We are looking at a select number of sources, and we as historians try to analyze and kind of see how this puzzle is being kind of fits itself.
Yeah,
right?
piecing the puzzle together.
And then imagine if you have this puzzle where many pieces are missing. So these puzzle pieces will be letters or memoirs or journals. So then the responsibility of historian is to essentially fill that gap with a puzzle piece of your own making. And this is where if I'm filling that puzzle, I might color it red, but Celeste, you or Martha, you can maybe do it in blue or green, right? And so that means his history. The way I write Chahin's The Falcon's story might be slightly different from yours because the color choices, the decisions or the interpretations we make will be different. Mm-hmm. And that goes to the complexity of history. That history... is it a hard science, right? Oftentimes you'll hear people ask, and of course the answer is no, because it's subjective. It's based on interpretation.
Yeah.
And this is your personal views, political, cultural, right? Shape how you perceive history and then how you deliver it to the broader audience.
Yeah.
It can be very powerful as well to how will I interpret this? Mm-hmm. And then coming from you, he comes from where you are from. Yeah. So it feels a lot more personal to tell his story.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's, again, when I first read these documents, and I was blown away by the fact that he is from not just the same country or region or the same city. I was like, maybe he lived down the street from me, right? So that makes it more personal. But also, I find his story indicative of millions of other lives that are kind of lost in the sense of time. But I feel that reclaiming their stories, giving the voice to the voiceless, so to speak, is a worthy endeavor in itself.
Yeah, it's so powerful.
Yeah, I think so too.
It's something that I get really like lost in thought about whenever you think about history and you find some like a lost voice, and you would never know anything about them if you didn't find like some random piece of like an archival materials.
Yeah, exactly right. Because in order, going back to your question on kind of how do we know what they thought or what they did and how they reacted, many of them left no literary legacy. So there are a few who wrote memoirs, and that certainly offers you a view. But it will be their particular subjective view. But a lot of those documents are piecing kind of puzzles from, let's say, police reports. Because one of the fascinating things I've discovered is that, of course, imagine being from a very different cultural, economic, political system, right, religious system, right? So these are people who were born and raised in the Caucasus, then become Muslims, then lived in Egypt, and then thrown into revolutionary France. So they had some difficulties adjusting. And the locals, the French, also had kind of a difficulty seeing them. And oftentimes you see them jeering at them, kind of calling names, racial slurs. And there is a lot of conflict. And of course, that means police gets involved. And once police gets involved, they write reports. So one way you can fill this puzzle is actually going to the police reports, long stacks of them, in order to find this needle. And that will be some of these guys getting arrested for violence.
That's so sad.
But from a historian's point of view, it's exciting.
It's great for you.
I wish they had caused more ruckus, actually more trouble.
It's just more pieces of the puzzle falling into place.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And just to add a layer to it, you might kind of wonder why would Napoleon or the French government actually want them, right?
Yeah.
These are the refugees and immigrants. And especially immigrants that used to be your enemies. And what happens is Napoleon weaponizes the perception, the imagery of them. And when he brings these Mamluks to France, he forms a special military unit, which is given a lot of privileges in France and becomes part of the imperial guard. And he parades these Mamluks on every occasion. So every time he's out, he's accompanied by Mamluks. Every time there is a parade, they lead the parade. So that means there is a lot of imagery that is commissioned by the state or drawn by the artists where Mamluks are visible. And it's done for political purpose, because here what the French state is doing, what Napoleon is doing, is essentially says here was a fearsome enemy, an oriental enemy, quote unquote, that we've defeated, brought here and civilized. And now this is a symbol of our triumph. It's a symbol of the imperial state. It's a revolutionary symbol because we try to spread freedom and equality, but it's also an imperial symbol because they are now serving our cause. So for me, it's this story is not just all about individual experience, but also how state uses the propaganda or uses a group of people as a symbol of its own greatness.
Did that help with like public opinion at all?
Yes.
Okay.
So these Mamluks come over around 1801. And initially, the first 2 years are kind of full of tensions and police reports. But then by 1803, they are kind of become associated with the imperial regime to such a degree that, as I said, they're paraded everywhere. And newspapers write this, enthusiastic stories about how cool it is to be empire and to have these former enemies actually serving you. And then once the new wave of this war begins, right, because we have a short break between 1802 and 1804, and then the Mamluks are becoming the face of the regime. So they are at forefront of fighting for France all across Europe. But it also creates an added layer of complexity, because in 1808, Napoleon decides to conquer Spain. And so he sends troops there to occupy the capital, Spanish capital, city of Madrid. But of course, if you're familiar with the Spanish history, you know that one of the defining features of Spanish history is this long struggle against Muslims called Reconquista, right? Almost 700 years of struggling against the Moors, and it shapes the Spanish identity. Well, when the French army comes to Madrid, guess who is leading them? Mamluks, and Mamluks are dressed in Oriental clothing. So it creates this layer where, from a Spanish point of view, Napoleon is not the revolution incarnate, but he's also bringing back the very people that they fought against for centuries. So you have an uprising in May, this Dos de Mayo uprising in May of 1808, and the target of the Spanish fury are the Mamluks, and there's this savage massacre of them by the Spaniards because they think these are the people who are coming back to re-enslave them.
Was that intentional on Napoleon's part? Or like, did you think like this is going to remind them of past hurt? Let me use them for that.
No, Napoleon was a very good student of history, but on this occasion he didn't pay, I guess, sufficient attention to the sensibilities, what their presence, the Mamluk presence, would how it would have kind of reflected in the perceptions of the Spaniards. But he quickly learned. Some Mamluks stayed in Spain, but they were kind of not kept in the cities, but sent in kind of countryside.
And how did it's Jean, right?
Jean Chahin?
Jean. What did he experience through all of these?
His life is incredible. He will be wounded more than 45 times. In some of these medical reports that I've read, in single battle, he's injured 25 times. And it's just how he made it is stunning. But it's also, again, another pathway into history because his survival is also a story of the medical breakthroughs, the medical improvements that the French are making at this time. One of the pioneering doctors, one of the greatest military surgeons in history is a Frenchman who serves in Napoleon's army, Dominique Larrey, and he comes up with these innovations, develops what we now call kind of MASH units, right, where they can do the triage on the battlefield and save people. So Chahin is treated by Larrey, and he's saved by him because, this guy is operating somewhere right at the edge of medical medicine, or the military medicine. But he fights in every campaign that Napoleon fought, and remarkably against all odds, he survives when almost all of his companions die. And then by the end of it, in 1815, he's at Waterloo. He sees Napoleon's defeat. He sees the empire crumbling, and he comes back. And then it dawns on him that now that Napoleon is gone, he doesn't have he doesn't have a citizenship. He doesn't have any legal status in France. Until now, he was part of the regime, and regime treated him well because he was a symbol of, a political symbol. But in 1815, Chahin realizes that he's a foreigner. He's an immigrant with no rights. He doesn't even, after all these years of fighting, he doesn't even have a pension or the right to a pension. So he actually applies for the French citizenship. And the dossier that I looked at is interesting because there, the officials, the authorities ask him, well, prove us that you deserve to be Frenchman, right? What does Frenchness mean to you, or French citizenship? And so he asked now to explain how is it that he deserves, a foreigner, right, deserves to be part of the French society.
You can show him all of his 45 injuries.
And at this point, he's like, it had been 15 years that he served in the army or something like that. Too.
Yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah. So ultimately in 1818, when this official, Monsieur Levesque, sits in his office in February and looks at this dossier, I think he would have had the same feeling that I had. I was like, darn it, this guy deserves it. Right?
Yeah.
So he writes this really effusive report in which he calls Chahin the bravest man in the French army. So how can we deny him the status? And ultimately he gets the citizenship. And so he retires to the small town on the outskirts of Paris, which I visited in search of his house and in search of his tomb. But about 15 years after the end of the war, now we're in 1830, and France is in a search of kind of rediscovering what it is about. And for the French government in 1830, part of the answer of French greatness, and it's almost Trumpian in that making France great again, right? Well, the answer for the French government in 1830 was colonies. Let's go and grab some more land.
As you do.
As you do, that's right. Not Greenland. In the French case, it's Algiers. And so when they announced an expedition to Algiers, the Falcon Boy volunteered for it. And again, that for me, it's a fascinating kind of aspect to it. Why he volunteered? Why would he leave the comforts of his life in a small town and go overseas, right, for this war? Is it part of his kind of sense that he's tired of the routine of the life and in search of adventure? Or did he become so Frenchified that he believes in the destiny of France, the civilizing mission, that France deserves to have a colony and that it's better for the Algiers to be in France? Well, ultimately, he goes over, he contributes to the French conquest of Algiers without realizing that it will create a festering wound that will bother French state and society for the next 132 years. And then he returns back in 1838 and quietly passes away in his home at this sleepy town of Melun.
What did he die from?
Old age, I guess. So he would have been, at that time, about in his mid-60s. But as so far as, I found actually in the local archive the document certifying his death and burial. So they say just illness without specifying which one.
It's so interesting that he just kept fighting.
Yeah. I guess the only thing he knew, right?
All he knew.
Yeah.
And I think it's so weird that military life, like being a military slave, would be like the way to go, because you're at risk of dying all the time. How much did he get paid, like as a soldier or as a Mamluk? When he was living in Egypt, so Mamluks lived in households. And the way they structured this is interesting, and going back to the issues of identity. So when you were kidnapped as a child and you're brought on the slave market or to Egypt, they deliberately erase your identity. So they change your name, they change your faith, they teach you different language, different writing, right? So this guy would have been Georgian Christian, would have spoken Georgian, and then in Egypt he converted to Islam, learned Arabic, and became a Mamluk, right? And then he's put in a household. And inside the household, you have people from almost all over the Middle East, Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and they all put together and they are essentially told that now you are brothers, and they're calling each other brothers. And then the head of the household, the slave owner, right? They call him father. So it's a weird kind of dysfunctional family, right? That they are creating in order to replace the family that you lost. So family doesn't pay you salary, right? You're part of the family, but you benefit from being part of the family because this is it's a family that engages in a racket, right? It collects taxes from other people. Now, when he came to France, he was paid decent salary as a soldier because he was not just a soldier, he was an officer, not just an officer, but he was an officer of the Imperial Guard, the most elite of the forces in Europe. So he made good money while he was serving. But as always, there are expenses, there are issues, there are problems that come with it. And of course, after Napoleon is defeated, he loses all of it because he's going to associate with Napoleonic regime. Now, what I find, what drew me to this topic is not just the challenge of crafting history, not just the exciting story of this one man who went through so much, but also a challenge of how you convey it, the history, right? Because historians write a lot of different historical work, but usually it's a book or an article. So what I thought immediately about this story is that it's a visual story. It's a story that has a lot of color, and a lot of kind of different dress and landscapes and Caucasus and Egypt and France, and then all across Europe you can go through. He survives the Napoleon's infamous campaign in Russia where 500,000 men disappeared, right? And so for me, the answer was, well, I think this is a graphic story. It's a story that is very conducive to visuals. So what my goal is to not simply have an article that very few people will actually bother to read, but to have a graphic novel that will be based on sources, historical sources, and will convey the story in a visual way, like a comic book, right? Where the reader can read it as a comic book and enjoy the graphic version of it,
And then if they're interested to see, oh, wait, why, how was the story put together, then look at the second half of the comic book, so to speak, and there it will be a traditional, quote-unquote, history explaining what are the sources, what are the puzzle pieces that were missing, and how I filled it. And so together I brought you some examples of it so you can actually see the graphic version of about first quarter of the book.
And I mean, you can't see this on our podcast, but it does look super cool.
It's so cool. And it fits with his story because he seems like such a demigod figure.
Yeah.
Whenever I was reading like all the wounds he went through, he would get hurt and then he's back to battle. I'm like, are you a god?
It's crazy that he kept fighting after
I would have given up. Like, I'm out, y'all.
Oh yeah, sometimes he's back in action like 6 months after the really grievous injury. And here I am. I had a knee surgery about 3 months ago, and I'm still hobbling.
Just to wrap up, last question. So what is the Mamluks' legacy today? Like, how is this a recent thing that historians are looking at and studying? And what does that look like for French history, like for Napoleon and his wars?
That's a great question because I think it goes to the heart of kind of evolving notions of what history is about. As I mentioned at the beginning, for a long time, history was perceived to be about the quote-unquote great man. And it will be a history from the top, looking at a few individuals at the top and how they're kind of impacted. But of course, over the last, I would say about 30, 35 years, we've gone through a major reassessment what history is about. And especially in the recent years, we talk about kind of quote-unquote decolonizing history. It is moving away from a Eurocentric or the great man-centered narrative and looking more and more to the ordinary experiences, to experiences that tell us more about what life was like. And I think Mamluk's story is a perfect conduit for it because through this one man, you can explore the realities of life in Caucasus, the harsh reality of the slave trade. What was it like to be in Egypt in the 18th century, especially in the second half of the 18th century, and have this relationship between slaves who are elite and the ordinary people who are actually virtually enslaved. And then you can also follow these evolving notions of what revolution is about, right? What equality meant or freedom meant to different groups of people, especially to people like Chahin, whose notions of who they are themselves, right, their identity, has gone through so many transformations. And so the fact that you can dabble and can address and deal with so many different sides of history through just one life tells you how many other stories are there to be discovered and to be told.
Yeah, no, but it's so important. Like, it's such a good message. And we want to thank you so much for coming.
No, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And if anybody listening wants more information or anything, feel free to look for it on our webpage. Alex, do you have anything you want to plug before
No,
we
hey,
let
this is
you
a great
go?
project and all the best to you.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.